The First World War irrevocably transformed the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled the region for centuries, was crumbling. Arab nationalism was on the rise, fueled by promises of independence from the European powers. Among these powers was Great Britain, which saw a strategic opportunity in the region. Britain's involvement would have profound consequences for both Arabs and Jews, particularly in Palestine. The war's end saw the Ottoman Empire dismantled. The stage was set for the creation of new states, but also for future conflicts. Britain's wartime promises to both Arabs and Jews would prove difficult, if not impossible, to fulfill. The seeds of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict were sown in the ashes of World War I. In 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, a document that would reverberate throughout the 20th century. This declaration expressed British support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This declaration was met with mixed reactions. Zionists, who advocated for a Jewish state in Palestine, celebrated it as a major victory. Palestinians, the majority Arab population of Palestine, viewed it with apprehension and anger. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret pact between Britain and France, further complicated matters. This agreement carved up the Ottoman Territories into spheres of influence, with Palestine falling under British control. The agreement contradicted promises of Arab independence and fueled resentment towards the European powers. The Balfour Declaration and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, both products of wartime expediency, laid the groundwork for future conflict in Palestine. Following World War I, Palestine was placed under British administration as a League of Nations mandate. The mandate charged Britain with the seemingly impossible task of creating the conditions for both Jewish and Arab self-determination. Jewish immigration to Palestine increased under British rule, causing tensions with the Arab population. Both Jewish and Arab nationalism intensified during this period. Zionist organizations, with British encouragement, established institutions and infrastructure in preparation for statehood. Palestinians, feeling increasingly marginalized in their own land, resisted Jewish immigration and British rule. The British found themselves caught between these competing nationalisms, unable to reconcile their conflicting promises. As the Second World War ended, the situation in Palestine reached a boiling point. The British, exhausted and facing pressure from both sides, referred the issue to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the UN voted to partition Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. The partition plan was accepted by Jewish leaders but rejected by Palestinian and Arab leaders, who saw it as unjust and a violation of their right to self-determination. The partition plan was never implemented. Fighting broke out between Jewish and Arab forces, marking the beginning of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The war resulted in a decisive victory for Israel, which declared its independence on May 15, 1948. For Palestinians, this event marked the Nakba, the catastrophe. Over 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes, becoming refugees in neighboring countries. Section 5. A land divided, the aftermath of 1948 and the persistence of conflict. The 1948 war did not resolve the conflict, but rather froze it in place. Israel emerged as a sovereign state, while the Palestinian territories were divided between Egypt, which took control of the Gaza Strip, and Jordan, which took the West Bank. The refugee crisis became a defining feature of the conflict, with Palestinians scattered across the region, yearning to return to their lost homes. The decades that followed saw a series of wars and uprisings. The 1967 Six-Day War resulted in Israel's capture of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, and Sinai Peninsula. The occupation of these territories further complicated the conflict, leading to the displacement of more Palestinians and the establishment of Israeli settlements. The Palestinian national movement, fragmented and dispersed, struggled to find a unified strategy to achieve its goals. Section 6. Dispossession and Despair, the Palestinian Refugee Crisis. The plight of Palestinian refugees remains one of the most intractable issues of the conflict. Over 70 years after their displacement, millions of Palestinians remain scattered across the region, living in overcrowded camps or struggling to integrate into host societies. The right of return for Palestinian refugees is a key demand of the Palestinian leadership and a major stumbling block in peace negotiations. The refugee crisis is not merely a humanitarian issue, but a political one. It is a constant reminder of the unresolved issues of 1948 and the ongoing displacement of Palestinians. The refusal of successive Israeli governments to allow for the return of refugees is seen by Palestinians as a denial of their history and their right to self-determination. Section 7. Settlements and Occupation, Obstacles to Peace. Since 1967, Israel has pursued a policy of settlement expansion in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. These settlements, considered illegal under international law, have fragmented the Palestinian territory and created obstacles to a viable Palestinian state. The settlement enterprise is seen by Palestinians and much of the international community as a deliberate attempt to prevent a two-state solution. The occupation has also imposed severe restrictions on Palestinian movement, economic development, and access to resources. Checkpoints, permits, and the separation barrier have created a system of segregation and control, limiting Palestinian freedom and opportunity. The occupation has had a devastating impact on Palestinian society, fueling resentment, frustration, and violence. Section 8. The Illusion of Peace, the Oslo Accords and their aftermath. The 1993 Oslo Accords offered a glimmer of hope for a negotiated settlement. The Accords, signed by Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, were based on the principle of land for peace. They envisioned a gradual Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories and the establishment of a Palestinian authority with limited self-governance. However, the Oslo process ultimately failed to deliver on its promises. Settlement expansion continued, violence escalated, and trust between the two sides eroded. The assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin by a Jewish extremist in 1995 dealt a fatal blow to the peace process. The Second Palestinian Uprising, or Intifada, erupted in 2000, dashing hopes for a negotiated two-state solution. Section 9. Eruptions of Violence, the Second Intifada and beyond. The Second Intifada, sparked by Ariel Sharon's provocative visit to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, marked a turning point in the conflict. The uprising, characterized by Palestinian suicide bombings and Israeli military incursions, led to a dramatic increase in violence and casualties on both sides. It also hardened attitudes and made a negotiated solution seem increasingly remote. The years since the Second Intifada have seen a cycle of violence and retaliation. Israel has launched several military operations in Gaza, resulting in heavy civilian casualties. Palestinian rocket fire from Gaza has also claimed Israeli lives and instilled fear in Israeli communities. The absence of a political horizon and the lack of accountability for human rights violations have created a dangerous and volatile situation. Section 10, May 2021. A turning point. In May 2021, tensions in Jerusalem boiled over, leading to an 11-day conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. The conflict, sparked by the threatened eviction of Palestinian families from their homes in East Jerusalem and clashes between Israeli police and Palestinian worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, drew international condemnation and calls for a ceasefire. The May 2021 conflict, while not the first of its kind, highlighted the fragility of the status quo. and the urgent need for a just and lasting solution. It also brought renewed attention to the root causes of the conflict, including the occupation, the settlement enterprise, and the plight of Palestinian refugees. Section 11. A call for justice, a plea for peace. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of the most enduring and intractable conflicts of our time. It is a conflict rooted in history, land, and identity. It is a conflict that has claimed countless lives, displaced millions, and fueled cycles of violence and hatred. Yet, amidst the despair, there remains a glimmer of hope. A just and lasting peace, while elusive, is not impossible. Achieving peace will require a fundamental shift in approach. It will require an end to the occupation, a dismantling of the settlements, a just resolution to the refugee issue, and a recognition of the rights and aspirations of both Palestinians and Israelis. It will require leadership, courage, and a willingness to make difficult choices. During World War II, Jews suffered in Nazi-occupied ghettos. It's astonishing that those once oppressed have become oppressors. Since 1967, Israel has occupied Palestinian territories, making life miserable for inhabitants. As someone opposed to wars and violence, I aim to remain objective. However, the international community's silence and complicity in Israel's policies for decades are alarming. It's time for truth and action. The international community has a moral and political responsibility to act. The time for peace is now.